Hello and welcome to XR Decolonise, Decarbonise at the Vault Festival. Today we have a mixed bill under the title, What About China? I am a British East Asian doing a lot of climate activism, and I get asked this a lot. Why should the UK do anything? We all know China's the biggest problem. What about China? Why don't you go and protest in China? And I never really know how to respond to that. So I thought, aha, we've got this space, we've got some experts. Let's see if we can unpick it. During the October Rebellion, I actually wrote a little piece, a piece of theatre that was performed around about in London on the various stages. And first up, we've got Susie Hung, who's going to perform a little monologue that I wrote called An Apology. It was really looking into kind of the issues about China, about carbon offsetting, and whose fault anything really is. So here we go, someone who would like to apologise to us all.
I work in a factory in Shanghai. Long hours and tough, but I'm happy to have a job. And if I stop being happy, there are nets outside the window to help keep us safe. Back home, my siblings can't really play outside without masks on. And the pollution here is not too good either, so I guess our lungs aren't in the greatest shape. My country has the largest carbon footprint. And that's my fault. Because I stand for up to 16 hours at a time in a production line putting screens on iPhones. So I have to admit my culpability and beg your forgiveness. Oh, no, I don't have an iPhone, but I make them. So the carbon is mine. And I feel bad. I really do. I feel really bad that I'm personally responsible for the climate catastrophe. And I also feel bad that I won't really be around to help when things get really dire. Shanghai is a coastal city, so the most vulnerable city in the world. And so I'll be underwater and out of the picture pretty soon. Me and 17.5 million others. And we'll deserve it. When people in the West point to China for a huge carbon footprint, I just want to die of embarrassment and how selfish we are. Why should anyone in the rest of the world do anything about their emissions when China is the real bad guy in all of this? We burn tons of the UK's rubbish every year, releasing the toxic fumes into the air. We produce half of the world's steel. We feed the whole world's need for plastic toys and smartphones and flat screen TVs. Oh, no. I don't have a TV. I don't have time to watch TV. I work long hours and tough, but I'm happy to have a job. And I wish I could stand up and say, stop, close the factories. But my family need to eat. I'm sorry. I know it's selfish. But as long as you keep wanting things, I'll keep making them. I'm just so sorry it's costing your future to do that.
Thank you, Susie. And next up we have Jen Lim, who will be performing Big Country, Things Are Getting Better by Daniel Yorklow.
Ordinary people, they're called 老百姓, leading ordinary lives. Ordinary songs they must sing. They shouldn't make demands. They shouldn't try and revolt. Body and soul must always meet to this task you devote. In that big country, there we dream big dreams and big hopes. In that big country, with a big state that watches with a big scope. But things are getting better. 现在好了. Economic growth is precedence. The upgrade grades so fast. Pollution is inheritance. The smokestacks roar and blast. Fire the path to parity, become a nation state slipping in polarity, fossil fuel and angry sulfate. As ordinary people, you're called 老百姓, leading ordinary lives. Revolutionary songs you must sing. You're thrown hard by fate. You try to stay afloat. Body and soul must always meet to this task you devote. In that big country, that big blank canvas, one harmonized voice. In that big country, one big mass of peoples, no democratic choice, but things are getting better. 现在好了. Top-down capitalism, trickle-downing vision. But no social safety net leaves you stranded in the debt of a war on the environment, which responds with passive violence from the wasted plains of Xinjiang to the factories down south, reclaimed on island Chaofeidian, abandoned in the west. While millionaires in Shanghai bars accumulate their wealth, you sold your blood and breathed in tar. The cancer village trades its health. Things are getting better. 现在好了. Things are getting better. 现在好了. Things are getting better. In that big country, with a big century of humiliation, in that big country, one belt and road vision, and things are getting better. 现在好了. 1 billion human needs, 1 billion hungry mouths, 1 billion rising dreams. How many floods and droughts? So many hungry people, you can slip between the cracks. How can they all be equal when the train comes off the tracks? 1 billion human voices, they gather you in concert. 1 billion possible choices, they weaponized your hurt. No cultural revolution now. Structural confusion, more like Mao, must somehow keep authority to lift the billion out of poverty, with Politburo coalition in the face of old historic division, uprisings and rebellions. All was chaos under heaven. Local government autonomy bound up and lost within bureaucracy. While industry resists restraint, and our growth must dominate, human labor, human rights, far away and mountains high. Things are getting better. 现在好了. Things are getting better. 现在好了. Things are getting better. Governing a big country needs big acquiescence. Governing a big country needs big surveillance, but things are getting better. 现在好了. New frontier in the West. The people there are told it's best for the interests of the territory. Training camps are mandatory for big integration in the big country. Human rights means not going hungry, but no big thoughts and no big dreams. Nothing they can label a big scheme. For big resources, there are big recourses and solutions sundry for 1/6 of a big country. But things are getting better. 现在好了. The hottest place in this vast land is the depression of Turpan. Too hot for the Monkey King and Tripitaka on their road to enlightenment in Gandhara. The only way to cool this land was to win the hand of Princess Ironfan. Now wind turbines attempt this same trick as humanity's clock stubbornly ticks. But things are getting better. 现在好了. In that big country that exerts big control, but can't stop its big region cadres finding big loopholes, as it strives for big progress harder, state newsfeed waxes lyrical on the scientific miracle of the big railway to the top of the world. They say could never be built, but now big plans unfurl, technological genius, artificially frozen permafrost, big mountain desert, big methane gas alert, 50 times higher than carbon dioxide, wreaks havoc on the big lost countryside. Nomadic lifestyle over, as the big world moves ever closer and big crowds come with big enthuse to climb the big mountain in big queues, leaving beer cans and plastic bottles while the ice melts and the plateau throttles. But I saw a film of a coin being balanced on a windowsill of a high-speed train that was so smooth the coin couldn't fall. Was it a 50-cent coin by any chance? Things are getting better. 现在好了. And on the far south small island, where the ordinary people aren't complying, the men in helmets are sent onto the street to fill the air with gas that is active when it heats. Made in the big country with aluminium and magnesium as its big crowd dispersal ingredient aimed at ordinary people who fear enforced integration into the one-party state, big powerful nation, with big finance and vast expense that want to advance, and the ordinary people must look askance as their fortunes dance, and they rely on chance and fight the dictum of big countries and their systems, and big talkers and their visions, and their racist derision that says you can't speak or contest or compete because it's not in their scheme. So remain unseen, where they want to stop your voice and they want to make your choice. They can place your world on a big buyer, but they can't extinguish your big fire. Why are the birds falling from the sky? 點解啲雀仔從天而降?
Thank you, Jen. Next up, we have a special video that's been made for us from a person you may have heard of, Howey Ou. Just to give you a bit of context, she mentions FFF quite a lot in her video. FFF is Fridays for Future, in case you're wondering, which is the school's climate strike that's been worldwide and that she has started in China.
Hi, XI UK, this is Boey. I am one of the initiator of FFF China. I am so pleased and grateful that you could organize this event to strengthen the mutual understanding to Chinese people. First, I would like to share why I started FFF in China almost a year ago. When I was interested in FFF and look up to learn more, I found that there are no Chinese joined the significant movement in China. I felt very lost and thought Chinese could not fail in this biggest battle. We must let the world see our responsibility. But if no one stands out, which is not acceptable, Chinese people will earn eternal infamy, and it will create more discrimination when we are abroad, which I was afraid of. However, I also predicted that I will be arrested or even die because of this. So it is very hard to choose. But with my nationalism thoughts, I think my sacrifice is worth. Luckily, this sacrifice is also good for the environment. Yeah. Second is about a small process, a small story of the process I'm making this video. When I heard that the name of the event is What About China, I thought it's about asking China to take the actions. And I almost refused to take this video because FFF and XR have already spitted by millions of people in China, which I was criticized that used by the Western countries. So I'm afraid of if the slogan spread and make a big movement, it will arouse the nationalism in Chinese people, and it will make the situation harder to develop the movement. But what I used my values to imagine have been proved wrong. Actually, there are already lots of people educated themselves to clear away the misunderstanding and be united over borders, just like you guys. Then, when I look at the avatar of Boey, is that I am English, then I form associated with I am Chinese, which is a famous Chinese people protest foreigners ridicule to Chinese. Then I also suddenly realized maybe the people from other countries have the same feeling as me. We are all doubt and feel others pointing at us. When this comes to an international level, it becomes nationalism. We may have heard it so deeply that we assumed people from different nations are different species, and we keep looking at each other with flaws deep-rootedly. Then wars and conflicts happen. We forgot we are all human, share the same earth. We have educated to make too much connections to the country, but very few connections to our planet Earth. However, their stereotype doesn't fit us global citizens. We are climate activists who have already stopped pointing at each other and taking actions. Only based on trust, we could make, and we will make, a more peaceful and just world. At last, I would like to apologize to the misunderstanding. And this event also educated me a lot. What above is just some humble opinions of mine. But thank you all for organizing this wonderful event. Bye.
Thank you, Howey. That was so lovely. And next up we have Dr. Sam Geall.
Cheers. So I think I'm going to speak for about 10-15 minutes as an intro to the conversation we're going to have subsequently. Just to give a bit of background, I guess, to particularly the development of China's kind of climate diplomatic position as a way into just thinking about kind of climate change policy and the debates around it in China and the rest of the world. Just to give it a little bit of background, I'm an anthropologist of China, but for the past 15 years or so, I've been working very specifically with an organization called China Dialogue. And we started specifically in response to this sort of what about China question. We saw that in in Western countries, China was typically used as an excuse for inaction. People would say, why should we do anything about climate change if China's opening, however many coal-fired power stations a week? In the Chinese context, it was similarly kind of difficult to talk about climate change, even if there was and continues to be a kind of growing permitted space for a debate about environmental issues. Climate was seen as something where the West was trying to dictate the terms of China's development, or to constrain China's right to develop. And so we saw an opportunity that if we could publish and translate the best of Chinese environmental opinion, activists, progressive policymakers, concerned citizens, the kind of environmental professionals, the kind of breadth of environmental and climate change opinion from China into the rest of the world, and then get global opinion about emerging kind of movements and changes and best practices, worst practices from around the world into China, we could create something that could maybe get past that impasse a little bit. And so my work has sort of been, I guess, revolving around this. But I thought what would be useful, just to give a kind of intro, would be to talk about not the past 15 years of kind of evolution of China's climate policies, but the last 5 years specifically, because I think it sets up a kind of interesting, it kind of puts us in the moment here where we can think about where we are and actually what might be happening, and sets up the kind of debate. So could I have the next slide, please? So if we think about Paris in 2015, there was, it's a pretty interesting moment to kind of consider. Obviously, everyone here will sort of know there was an agreement signed, in Paris, under the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention, which committed all of the world's countries to limit global emissions to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, efforts to get to 1.5 degrees, and that's an amazing thing. And it was an amazing thing partly because of the failure 6 years previous in Copenhagen, for which China was largely kind of cast as the villain. So there was something quite interesting that happened in 2015, which was China kind of being seen as suddenly a proactive force in the kind of global debate around climate change. And in no small part was that about a unprecedented at the time US-China announcement the previous year. And if you look at the next slides, you can see kind of why. Because clearly when it comes to the absolute volume of carbon emissions, China and the United States are the kind of global superpowers in this respect. And for once were kind of acting jointly as superpowers might on the kind of global sphere in making a joint announcement to, in the case of China, to set a peak year on their emissions and to commit to a gradual sort of efficiency improvements and eventual reductions. In the case of the US, to commit to absolute reductions in their carbon emissions. And with that, various commitments on share of renewable energy and so on. And between them, of course, they account for about 40% of global emissions. So it's really significant. Now, there's a flip side that you see on the next slide, which of course is that China is still a developing country within the kind of UN framework. It's a complicated issue exactly how that pans out in terms of global agreements, and it's changed with the Paris Agreement. But what's clear is that China per capita, of course, doesn't rank quite as high, and the US still, of course, is by far the biggest per capita emitter of carbon dioxide emissions. But of course, you can see China rising quite significantly, even on the per capita basis. It overtook the US very dramatically by volume in 2007, but actually over a similar period, it's managed to just edge above European per capita emissions over the last decade or so. But what's the problem with this? Why should we just all kind of relax because this agreement was signed? Well, clearly not. Then there's a couple of very big problems. First one is in the next slide, which is that there's still an enormous way to go. Even if everything was fine with Paris, and we didn't have anything to worry about at the level of the UN or global commitments, we're still way out of actually where we need to get to 2 degrees. And that's because within the agreement, there's this idea that we have to keep, in the sort of jargon of the agreement, keep ratcheting up emissions. We need to raise ambition. Because at the moment, even if everyone keeps their pledges, we're on course for 3-4 degrees of warming. So we're not on track. If you look at the next slide, that's a 32 gigaton gap between where we need to be to get to 1.5 and where we are, even if everyone keeps to their pledges. And there's a major problem with the idea of keeping to their pledges, and you'll see that in the next slide. That's what happened the next year, which is the election of Donald Trump. Now, that was really significant for lots of reasons, and he's done a lot of bad things, but there's a couple of really significant things here. One is that he trashed the Paris Agreement and climate science, and specifically committed the US to withdraw from Paris. But the other was that one constructive area of US-China cooperation, which was really constructive. I mean, that wasn't just a joint announcement. That actually did lead to genuine kind of joint work between the US and China on climate and energy cooperation and so on, was completely kind of blown out the water by Trump's election, and particularly by his kind of trashing of the agreement. So we're in a kind of difficult position in 2016. What's going to happen? Well, interestingly, what happened is what you see in the next slide, which is a commitment from Xi Jinping immediately after Trump's election to stay in the Paris Agreement. And then to go further than that, actually, at the Chinese Communist Party Congress the next year, to say China is now in the driver's seat on climate cooperation. So to actually say, interestingly, we're going to be the so-called torchbearers. We're going to actually take up a kind of leadership role here. Okay, so what does this mean? Can we sort of take this seriously? What I'd say very briefly to try and understand what this means is that we need to conceptualize this within China's own domestic national self-interest, and to understand why it might be a self-interested move for the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, for Chinese central government to back aggressive climate action. And I'd say there's a few really strong reasons why China might want to think that way. If you look at the next slide, you've got a pretty clear indication of China's own climate vulnerabilities. There's lots of those. I could spend a lot longer talking about this. But there is quite widespread understanding at elite policy levels and so on in China of the kind of levels of risks and uncertainties which China is exposed to. Northern China is already drought-ridden, has a very deep water crisis, which the uncertainties around which are only exacerbated by climate change. Southern China has a severe problem with too much water, with flooding, again, only exacerbated by climate change. And an export-oriented economy, as we've developed, as we've sort of discussed in some of the earlier monologues and so on, which has been very geared towards exports, has meant that there's been a very high urban concentration developed along the coastal regions, the eastern seaboard of China, which means lots of people living in very exposed low-lying coastal areas, which means very exposed to sea level rise, to saline intrusion, to increased tropical storm surges, all of the sorts of things that play out in the likelihood of a kind of catastrophic climate change. But there's a lot of other self-interested political economic reasons that the Chinese central government might want to move towards greater climate mitigation. If you look at the next slide, we've got the installations of solar PV capacity in 2016. You could have looked at any similar kind of graph over the past few years. China has become the leading investor, installer, exporter, producer of solar PV and of wind turbines. Why is that? Because China's economy the Chinese central government is trying very hard to move the economy away from low-cost manufacturing, energy-intensive and polluting production towards innovation and services, up the value chain, and towards being an exporter of the leading technologies around the world, and specifically the technologies that will be needed for a carbon-constrained world, so the kind of technologies of the future. And that's meant that there is a strong kind of policy alignment between a sort of low-carbon transition and where China's economy sort of wants to move, which is significant again. But there are other reasons too. If we look at the next slide, there's a dynamism that sort of plays out there, which means there's actually a kind of bottom-up reason to invest as the scale of production has sort of made this possible. Now, when I talked about what made the Paris Agreement possible, I talked about one element, which was the kind of unprecedented diplomatic realignment after Copenhagen that happened largely because of this initiative and this kind of partnership that developed between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama. Well, the other thing that happened is a real shift in the real economy in the same time, and that was largely the falling cost of renewables thanks to the scale of production in China, and what economists call the learning curve effect that came about as a result. So you've got this very dramatic sort of change happening around this time. But there's other things too. If you look at the next slide, you've also got the political imperative to achieve a certain level of party legitimacy, to deal with rising concern about environmental issues in China, specifically around things like air pollution. If you look at the next slide, you've got a picture I really like from a project called Float Beijing. This was in 2011, 2012, a group of students who started clipping small Bluetooth-enabled pollution sensors onto kites so that they could challenge the official narrative on air pollution. There was a very deep kind of winter smogs late in those years that people called the airpocalypse. And what people found is that the official government sort of readout on that wasn't taking account of the high levels of PM 2.5 pollution. The small particulate matter that lodges deep in the lungs is particularly hazardous to health. What people started doing was trying to challenge not only the pollution but the transparency around it in order to try and get some kind of change on that. And you got really significant, interesting kind of movements. In this case, the creation of a kind of mobile data set that also worked as a kind of art activism type piece. That was part of actually a successful challenge to transparency around air pollution in Beijing, led to unprecedented at the time level of transparency around air pollution that you now have access to through apps and so on in China. And from 2013 to 2018, really strict regulations on air pollution for the first time, so particularly in places like Beijing. So there was real policy change that kind of flowed out of that. But I guess now we have to kind of come up to the present. Where are we now? Let's look at the next slide. We've got some really positive and interesting kind of things. As environmental issues have been taken up more and more kind of by the center and become part of state policy in China, they've become a big part of China's sort of offer on the international stage. This year, China is playing host to the UN Biodiversity Conference for the first time. It's the first time that a big UN convention like this is being negotiated in China. It receives less attention than the UN Climate Convention, but it's just as important. It's supposed to be trying to help us kind of curb the sixth great extinction, which is happening right as we speak. So you've got a kind of a really important piece of the kind of global environmental governance challenge being taken up by China in the form of hosting this convention. You've also got China sort of, as I say, stepping up to be kind of more proactive in the UN Climate Convention and so on. So this seems like a significant thing, but it's part of a number of very increasingly competing priorities that we're seeing in an increasingly kind of fractious world order with a lot of different priorities. If you look at the next slide, this is my kind of very rough and completely unscientific impression of what might keep Xi Jinping awake at night, which is to say, there's a lot of different things that are weighing here. There's these signature leadership policies and legacies like the Belt and Road Initiative, which we can talk about more, and the ecological civilization kind of theory, which is a sort of signature leadership brand for Xi Jinping. But there's other things happening as well. Of course, there's the novel coronavirus and the kind of deep impact that that's having now on the economy and the need to re-stimulate the economy shortly afterwards, already taking place in a context where you've got the US-China trade war really kind of pressing at these very thin margin industries around the country, very leveraged, lots of issues there. You've got a poverty alleviation goal that's absolutely central to the legitimacy of the party. By 2021, China is supposed to have eradicated poverty across the country for the centenary goal. The centenary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 takes place, and by then you're supposed to have completely alleviated poverty. By 2049, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, China is a moderately prosperous nation. This is a big part of Xi Jinping's kind of offer around the concept of national rejuvenation and the kind of the project of coming out of a century of humiliation towards a century of kind of national rejuvenation. It's a very big issue. Plus, you've got Hong Kong, you've got a very bruising election in Taiwan, lots of things that will sort of play on the mind of the leadership in China, which means, in practice, there's a lot of push and pull at these sort of opaque levels of kind of protracted bargaining and elite sort of politics that actually makes up what happens at the top of the party in China. There's a lot of different things weighing on it. And as it happens at the moment, things probably aren't really going the right direction. If you look at the next slide, we've got what's happening with coal consumption. In 2013, there was a lot of hype about the idea that China's coal consumption might have peaked. We actually may have really turned a corner, and we'd be seeing the gradual kind of phase out of thermal coal, which is to say, coal-fired power, and corresponding kind of uptick of renewables. As it happens, the renewables keep coming online, but unfortunately, the coal production and consumption has ticked up again. As a percentage of the overall energy mix, it's falling, but that's still not really where people sort of expected to be at this time. And a lot of that is that kind of push and pull that happens with all those different forces and all those different kind of lobbies and so on that happen in the economy. So there's a lot of kind of work that needs to be done, and a lot of that supposed kind of mobilization and so on that we need, that, you know, we're also talking about in kind of the international system around, like, where do you get that pressure from? Well, it's tricky, because actually the sort of space for grassroots action and so on, and we can talk about that more, hasn't necessarily been maintained. And also, frankly, levels of concern aren't necessarily at the kind of height that they are in other places. The next slide is a recent poll of young people in China. There aren't that many good polls in China. I wouldn't take it that seriously, but I do think it's interesting that environment, and not even just climate change, but just environment in general, rated very low on polls of young people around sort of the greatest concerns in people's lives. And this is a marked contrast. I've looked at these polls against, you know, sort of US and Europe and so on. It is in marked contrast with you know, similar age cohort. So again, you know, there's an interesting question there about actually where the concern ever came from, how you get the right alignment kind of forces, how much you can expect in terms of kind of enhanced ambition or whatever from China. And then the other big issue, which is going to have to be on the agenda as we particularly go into this year of super year for the environment of COP26 and all these other big debates, is going to be China's Belt and Road Initiative. And that's my final very depressing slide I want to leave you with. As China's economy has slowed and as markets are sort of saturated, there's been the creation of something of an escape valve for overcapacity in the Chinese economy, essentially a way for big firms, infrastructure companies, state-owned enterprises, so on, to invest overseas in projects. Now, this could be an enormous boom for the renewable energy infrastructure that's needed for the transition. It could be an extremely positive thing. There's enormous development needs around the world. At the moment, the vast majority of that finance is going into very traditional forms of investment, and that means coal-fired power, steel, roads, very large-scale kinds of projects that aren't necessarily having development benefits that are going to be long-term and may indeed break Paris. So there's a really big kind of debate and a lot of things that are going to be kind of coalescing this year as we have a serious conversation about how to raise ambition. I'll leave it there, I think, and we can maybe unpack some of this stuff in the conversation. But thank you. Yeah.
So I'll just start with some brief introductions. And firstly, I also want to thank Beck for putting this event together. It's such an important conversation to be happening, and very timely as well. So I'll introduce myself first. My name's Nuala Gathercole Lam. I have worked on the Extinction Rebellion media team for the last year, which means that nothing shocks me anymore. And before that, I was a Chinese studies student and lived and worked in China in the civil society and a little bit as a journalist as well. This is a kind of intersection of my interests, I guess. And next to me is Emma Chan, who's a junior doctor, co-chair of Haringey Green Party, and stood as a Green MP in the 2019 general election. Jessie Lau, who's a journalist, researcher and artist from Hong Kong, covering identity, politics and human rights with a focus on China for international media. And Sam Geall, who we've just heard from, who's executive editor at China Dialogue, an associate fellow at Chatham House and associate faculty at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. And his research focuses on climate policy and politics, energy transition, environmental governance and civil society in China. And we would have also been joined by Rebecca Nadine, and she's director of the Overseas Development Institute's Risk and Resilience Programme, but unfortunately she's not able to be here today. I do actually have something from Rebecca, because I sent her my questions from the panel, so she's kindly written something which I think is worth reading out for everyone to hear. So Rebecca said, before criticising China's climate ambition, it would be better to understand the challenges the government is facing in ensuring jobs and livelihoods for 1.3 billion people. China now feeds 1/7 of the world's population using just 9% of its total arable land and just 6% of the world's renewable water resources. China, like many countries, is facing the challenge of how to support people to move out of poverty and ensuring jobs whilst managing the climate crisis. China ranks number 1 in the world for losses from climate change-induced natural disasters. So the need to address climate change is a priority for the Chinese government. In recent years, China has a number of policies that show strong commitment to low-carbon development and scaling up of clean energy, cutting domestic coal consumption and its commitments under Paris, greening the 13th five-year plan, Blue Sky Defence Battle, establishing green investment principles and its 2013 National Adaptation Strategy. But contradictions remain. The government has been promoting urbanisation. At present, 60% of the population live in urban areas, and by 2030 this will be much greater. But cities contribute 85% of China's CO2. Urban residents emit roughly 1.4 times more energy-related CO2 than rural ones. This is probably the same the world over. China is on track to meet its 2030 target, and on the surface it would seem there are promising signals for increased ambition. However, it is unclear what the political incentives would be for the government to raise its ambition. Basically, the assumption that the Chinese government is not taking climate change seriously is unhelpful and inaccurate. Yes, China has a long way to go, but so do most countries. The challenge for China is transitioning an economy that supports 1.3 billion people. It is not going to happen overnight. That is the reality. Using China as an excuse for inaction on climate change is exactly that, an excuse. I need to ask others to act before us or delay action at the individual until we see change at the national, at the international level, will do nothing to address the climate crisis. We need to move away from the blame game and start demonstrating what changes we are willing to make and accept. That's from Rebecca. That was a valuable contribution to read out, even though she can't be here. So I think that here on the panel, we should start by addressing the question that was set for this event, what about China? The assertion that why should the UK do anything when China is the biggest polluter? That's why we're here today, to have a more informed and nuanced discussion about China's role in the path to addressing the climate and ecological emergency. So I want to ask the panellists, is the prevailing assumption that China is an obstacle to addressing the crisis accurate, or are there reasons to be hopeful about the role that China could play? So maybe, Sam, you could kick us off with that one, if that's okay.
I mean, it's impossible to see any progress without China. Any serious kind of plan globally for meeting Paris targets and so on has to include China, which means you have to work constructively with China. There's no other way. And there are extremely positive and potentially very positive kind of future visions of how that could happen. And we have to work cooperatively to make those happen, frankly. I can't really see any other way through it. And particularly, I would say, through, and you've got to use the kind of vision that is politically feasible, as in any country. And that would probably mean through the so-called Green Belt and Roads kind of initiative, or thinking about the kind of role that China's playing in the Biodiversity Convention and so on to try and unlock that ambition, because there's really no other way through it. Otherwise, there isn't really one single thing you can say, particularly about China as an obstacle or not. It has had a number of different policies and positions at various different points, and it's not a monolithic state. There's a number of different actors and interests at work, and these things sort of manifest in different ways at different points. And China is already, by default, a leader on a lot of fields, including the production of renewable energy, which is, exactly what we need for the transition.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I could follow up to that as well, that I think, for a huge amount more people have got active in the environmental movement in the UK and around the world, with school strikes and Extinction Rebellion and various other things going on. And I think I certainly, and other people, want to understand what the relationship between change in places like the UK and in China is. So, for instance, on Thursday we had the ruling that the Heathrow third runway can't go ahead because it's not commensurate with Paris, with the temperature rise targets, and so things like that. Popular movements, legal wins, like abroad. Do they impact China, or what's the relationship between those things happening here and what China decides to do?
I think they do matter. I think that particularly those sorts of legal precedents and so on are genuinely of interest to legal activists, to NGOs, to the sorts of grassroots campaigns that initially kind of laid down the gauntlet to Chinese central government on moving away from the pollute first, clean up later sort of model of development, which they've been trying to do. So no, I think it's really important. I think it's much more important than the other form of kind of international example or pressure, which is kind of bashing China in the UN or whatever, which I don't think it's produced any positive result when it comes to climate change. Like I say, most of the positive things that have happened have been about political and economic pressure from different sort of sides, but essentially they're domestic stories in China.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that can lead us on to talk about the significance of civil society, and I wonder, Jessie, if you can kick us off on talking a little about the significance of civil society in influencing climate in China, and what impact the political tightening that we've seen in China since 2012 has had on the role that civil society is able to play.
Yeah, I think obviously the biggest constraints is like 10 years ago in China, you could have more small-scale protests and kind of different types of activities. But then increasingly that space has just shrank so dramatically, and especially now with coronavirus and Hong Kong protests, it's not just climate change, but activist groups on many different issues, from like gender, feminism to environment in general. That space has been completely restricted in many respects. But I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to environment in particular, which Sam, you kind of mentioned, is just this public ambivalence on the issue and the lack of concern in terms of it's really hard for grassroots activists in China doing environmental work to try to reach out, engage with Chinese people and kind of be able to communicate in the same way as Western societies are able to. And there are a few reasons why this is. So number one is, I think a lot of the coverage on climate change and environment in general in China is very much associated with climate conferences and kind of like global kind of big things like UN and kind of stuff we discussed. And so it's associated with political maneuverings. And so in many people's public perception, climate change is kind of, they see it as this geopolitical battle between China and the West. And you can kind of see this feed into the nationalistic sentiment, which makes it really hard for regular people, young people interested in environment to participate in these issues, because it feels like they can't criticize China, because then it's like they're betraying their country, which I think Howey Ou kind of talked about a little bit in her video. You can see this played out last year when in Greta's speech, where she kind of criticized world leaders for failing to take action on climate change, and it was praised worldwide. But then in China, the reactions on social media were largely negative, saying that she's a child and this is a first world problem, and in China we have to focus on things like poverty alleviation, etc. I think a lot of this is just the idea of Greta and people like her representing this liberal Western agenda, and so it's really hard for people to kind of back these kind of political activists. And although there are, I guess, young activists like Howey kind of doing work in China, and there's also a study in, I think, August in China Quarterly saying that young people and women in general are becoming more aware of global issues, global climate change issues, in China. But like Sam said, it still ranks really low on people's list of priorities. And the care is more, even when they do care, it's focused on more tangible things like air and water pollution, and not exactly climate change, which is very kind of an ambiguous idea in many people's minds. And on top of that, it's this idea that this is the government's responsibility and not citizens' responsibility. So you don't see campaigns of people being like, let's reduce my own carbon emission or go vegan or kind of like not use plastics. People don't really have that kind of social activist awareness. And I was recently talking to an activist where she's actually in Wuhan, and she was doing a little bit of activist work on single-use plastics, and she was really interested in doing that campaign. But she was like, it's basically in China, it's impossible to change my daily habits because of the way, just getting deliveries for food and just like everything in life is really difficult for you to kind of change your own personal habits. And then with the coronavirus now, everything has completely shifted in focus. So that's a lot there, but...
Thank you. And just because of time, I'm actually going to move on to the next question, just so we get to talk a little bit about the kind of range of issues. So I'm interested in hearing about where where this discussion around China and the environment, where the racism and the Sinophobia seeps in to arguments around China's environmental role in the world, or where each of you have encountered the anti-Chinese prejudice in your work relating to the environment. And Emma, maybe you could start here.
Sure. So I come at this more a kind of activism kind of angle, I guess. I think a lot of it is about kind of going back to the question that, or the sort of situation that Beck gave at the beginning. When you kind of talk about the work that you're doing, people kind of come up with, well, what about China? And I think that in itself is a kind of quite unhelpful way of framing things. I think it's kind of pointing the blame elsewhere rather than looking at what you can do, and I think that is rooted in sort of, if not quite racism, then certainly sort of prejudice. I think it's also rooted in a kind of, I think it's shaped by people's unwillingness to kind of reflect on their own behaviour and to take action at all. I think it's really easy on all sorts of levels, on kind of like racial or country or nationalistic, to say like, well, doing this isn't any good because this will still be happening, and that prevents you from doing anything. I think a lot of the dialogues around kind of environmental activism are shaped by that, not just in terms of race, but in terms of class and in terms of all sorts of issues. And I think that's one that I've kind of, I feel like I've encountered on a personal level, and sort of heard similar things to the question of this title, but just in a kind of a wider level as well.
Thanks. And Jessie, I think that I'd like to hear what you have to say about this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I touched on that a little bit earlier, just the idea of the environmental discourse in China being very much, I guess, translated into like a nationalistic sentiment, or how people interpret it as a term of Sinophobia when you criticize China. I think a part of that, why it's interesting, is because to kind of counter that, you kind of have to have this mentality, which kind of Howey said in her video, of that we're all part of the same planet, and that like there are huge natural disasters occurring, and that like we need to work together in order to combat them. But I think one thing in China is that, although like Sam pointed out, like there are so many issues with like coastal regions, kind of I guess like climate change will have a huge effect in China in general. There's kind of a lack of I guess urgency or public awareness on this in China, and people also don't, because there's such a restricted space in terms of disaster coverage in China. It's hard for people to imagine this, because whenever there's a larger scale disaster, many of this is censored in Chinese media. And so I think in this respect, it's kind of harder for people to envision and build those type of solidarities. And we can't look at xenophobia on climate change issues without thinking of just like China's I guess like geopolitical status worldwide, and how on so many levels, when it comes to the US trade war or Taiwan or Hong Kong, like people in China are feeling increasingly backed in a corner in this binary of it's the West versus China. And this is perpetuated by CCP state narrative in many respects, and because of that, it kind of complicates the environmental dialogue. But yeah, it's a really difficult issue.
Thanks. And is there anything that you'd want to add, Sam, there?
I'd just say that I'm constantly find myself having to explain away a couple of, explain, for example, that talking about China and the environment requires not thinking of China as an entirely monolithic society or state or set of actors, particularly when you're talking about Chinese overseas investment, when you're talking about these sorts of issues. There's an assumption, either a positive or negative one. Often, actually, European environmentalists do this thing of saying, well, if China gets serious about climate change, well, they can just fix it. It's great, as if there's no politics in China. I mean, China's an authoritarian regime, but it has very complex politics, as I've tried to sort of, unpack a little bit. And similarly, that can also be painted in a very sort of negative and racist, sometimes kind of light. And I find the increasing kind of atmosphere of essentially kind of hawkishness that Jessie referred to is complicating the kind of necessary cooperation that we're going to need. Whether it's on, there's all kinds of nuance to it, including the way that CCP uses these sorts of narratives, the way that they're very justified, criticisms of human rights abuse and so on that need to be made, but it doesn't mean that there aren't ways to create sort of international solidarity, and of course that requires being anti-racist, for example.
Thanks. I guess finally it would be good to understand what each of you think, or what we can expect basically from China's role in COP26. I don't know if each of you will want to speak to it, but those of you who do, just go ahead, really.
I mean, yeah. So I'm watching COP26 very actively. It's an extremely important moment. It's 5 years since Paris, and that's significant partly because countries are supposed to come in with these revised pledges to the UN, where they're supposed to have raised their ambition. So it's a significant moment, and things aren't really on track so far. The last talks were pretty bad. The UK has been pretty distracted, for obvious reasons, and there, in order to kind of unlock that so-called like joint diplomatic ambition that you might need, that includes China, there aren't that many diplomatic routes you can currently take, and we're not at this moment where we had that Xi Jinping, Barack Obama kind of stars aligning. The only thing that might be equivalent is between the European Union and China. And there's this big summit in Leipzig in September that Merkel's hosting, Macron is very involved in it as well, trying to get an EU-China kind of agreement in place in order to try and raise ambition. So that's like one kind of diplomatic hope there. But I wouldn't really put all like your eggs in that basket, and also the UK doesn't really have much role in that since we Brexited, so who knows if it really is on track for what we need at COP26. So then where's the ambition going to come from? Well, it's kind of got to come from outside of nation states. It's got to be the cities, it's got to be the NGOs, it's got to be the youth movements and all of the kinds of things that XR represents. And so it's an interesting moment to see whether you can get some kind of real push in that regard.
Thanks. Is there anything the two of you would like to add on that point?
I think it's interesting hearing kind of your take of like, I guess has to depend more on like grassroots organizing, just because things are so difficult in China context. But I wonder, because when I think of COP26, I feel quite pessimistic of all the reasons that you talked about, and how it seems like the narrative of China being like a leader on environment has reshifted in terms of its priorities now, with especially economic growth, the economic slowdown, and coronavirus. But perhaps maybe there's a way to kind of look at Hong Kong and Taiwan and efforts there as well, because I think sometimes when we talk about Greater China, we kind of ignore kind of Hong Kong and Taiwan. So maybe there are some possibilities there. So something to look into.
Well, thanks everyone. It was really good. I'm gutted we didn't have longer to discuss all of this, but yeah, really great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.